They have we in like a pack of sardines, and we cannot escape, we cannot come out. Mama.
I like Ford. I'm not gonna hold y'all. I really like Ford. Back when I was in college, I had a green Ford Thunderbird, and it was a 1992. It was a sport model with a 5-liter V8, the Windsor, not the Coyote. But the thing about that Ford Thunderbird, when I initially had it, even though it was rusted underneath, it still got me from point A to point B relatively without any problems. Considering it was a 20-year-old car, it was pretty much a hoopty, but it was built very well. As time went on, I began to notice that Ford and their quality began to shift for whatever reason, and one of the biggest quality control issues to ever hit Ford has been the dual power shift clutch transmission of the Ford Fiesta and the Ford Focus. What went wrong, you ask? I think I have an answer for you. What's up, guys? My name is Chris, and welcome to The Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars, news, and reviews. If you are new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. So the other week, I did a video explaining the costly oversight with Kia, and if you want to go check that out, feel free to do so. But essentially what I understood was that in many cases with a lot of these quality control issues, it always boils back down to cost. This particular tale includes one big car company, one big loan, and one really minor nuance that refused to budge and created a mess of problems. So with that being said, stick around and stay tuned, because you are now watching The Breakdown. Ford, of course, we all know who they are. The big blue oval, the big champagne, the big cojones. Ford is probably a household name to many who have never driven before. And there are two very critical models in this story, which is the Ford Fiesta and the Ford Focus. The Ford Fiesta and the Ford Focus have long been in the repertoire of Ford, with the Fiesta being significantly older, introduced in 1976, whereas the Ford Focus was introduced roughly around 1998. The Ford Fiesta so far has had roughly around 7 generations and was recently discontinued in an effort for Ford to be able to move towards electrification shortly thereafter, as it was produced in mostly Mexico and would eventually be produced elsewhere. But I digress. So the Ford Focus, on the other hand, but primarily made much of its headway to us over in the United States around 2000. And in both the European and American markets, both Fiesta and Focuses up until the 2010s was relatively successful. The first 2 generations of the Focus did relatively well, and with the exception of some engine failures to some degree, the Focus was pretty reliable and was an entry point into Ford's brand. The Fiesta, on the other hand, is considered to be a super mini and is highly successful in Europe, particularly because of their roadways as well as their transportation model. Unlike the Americas, where we heavily depend on cars, it is not the same over in Europe. So getting into it, this tale is a matter of politics. You see, the Ford Focus and Ford Fiesta are considered to be global models. The Ford Fiesta was put on the global B platform, whereas the Ford Focus was put on the C platform. So the cool thing about both of these cars is that you could get them relatively well packaged and well valued, and they typically came with either 4-speed or 5-speed transmission. They could be gotten as a manual and automatic. They could be gotten as a coupe. They could be gotten as a wagon. They could be getting in any flavor that you desired, so long as it was a Ford. And the interesting thing is that the Ford Focus for the second generation was relatively reliable, and most of the Fiesta was pretty well over in Europe. Now, these transmissions that were typically produced in the Fiesta Force, especially the dual clutch transmission, was produced by GetRag. GetRag was a subsequent supplier company that was working as a co-venture with Ford and pretty much helped them to develop a lot of the transmissions alongside many other manufacturers. Okay, so clock it. Basically, the dual clutch transmission worked like this. The dual clutch transmission, in theory, was designed to give the shift power of a manual but the efficiency of an automatic, and essentially it had 2 different gears that alternated between even and odd, and in some degrees idle and neutral. It was a very complex system, but the dual clutch transmission has been used by the Germans for quite some time. The thing is that when trying to innovate, you have to be very careful about what decisions you make, because it can be an absolute nightmare, and that's exactly what happened. The dual clutch transmission, unlike many others for Ford, was that it was a dry clutch transmission. Apparently, this was a tightly sealed, very, very close bonded, and it was expected to be a lighter and more efficient transmission, roughly giving you better fuel economy for 9 to 10%. Now, there is some level of speculation that I have, but hold on. So when they released this transmission, I don't know what Ford was thinking. In fact, I do know what they were thinking. They were thinking dollars. The reason why I feel like Ford made this decision partly is because this was partly around the time of the United States bailout, in which we know the big three had to work very hard to get the government to help them out, because essentially the housing crisis of 2008 pretty much bankrupted everybody. But a lot of consumers obviously were not able to buy cars, and it just was a mess. During the time of development at this time was happening, the government was giving out candy for all intents and purposes, and Ford wanted a piece. So Ford took out a $6 billion loan around 2009, and alongside Nissan and Tesla, they were expected to pay a lot of that money out. And essentially, there's some controversy behind that as well. So in the agreement of that loan, it was expected that Ford would be able to use a lot of that money towards a lot of their inventory models that they currently had, and one of them being the Ford Focus as well as the Ford Fiesta. And during the same time, this is when Ford would introduce the idea of a dual power shift clutch transmission, coded DPS6. Now, I want y'all to keep this in mind, right? We forget that the transmissions of today are very different from back then. Have you ever gotten to a 5-speed transmission? It's the ghetto.
It's Milky Way ghetto.
But because it is not as efficient and solely outdated, Ford wanted to make a little bit of innovative technology, and one of them being the transmission. Now, the dual clutch transmission itself is not necessarily the issue, as long as it was designed with a wet clutch style design in mind. However, somebody at Ford absolutely refused to do that. Now, that goes into a deeper issue of politics, which we won't get, but it is alleged that in that time, Ford knew exactly what was going on. Shortly at launch, before the transmission was introduced into both the Fiesta and the Focus, several engineers and several internal employees had complained that this was not ready for production. Being that it is oftentimes frowned upon for you to vocalize some concerns, it was acknowledged, allegedly, that Ford pretty much said, be a team player. Don't be that guy. Shut the And so because of that, Ford basically continued with the rollout. Going forward from 2011 to 2018, the Ford Focus and the Ford Fiesta would be seen as one of the most problematic and pieces of junk that Ford has ever produced. Ford is not absolved of any recalls, much different than any other manufacturer. In fact, some of your faves have had their own set of recalls. Some of your faves still have recalls. I'm not saying no names, but I'm gonna tell you that they're out there. The dual clutch transmission at the time created a lot of problems. One of the biggest complaints that many consumers had, aside from the idea that it just sucked, is that the transmission was not a very smooth ride at takeoff. One of the biggest complaints that came from this car was that it was jerky, it was stuttery, and at some point it would just cut off mid-power, and there were times where consumers would be driving and it would essentially create a situation where it could be very deadly if the wrong variables happen. And it was very clunky. And I remember working at Enterprise, and I also remember how I was selling the idea because I just was green at the ears. I would tell people that when they would complain about the Ford Focus that, no, it's great, it's just the European transmission, it's fancy. That's what I told people. I mean, I didn't lie. That's what it was. Now, granted, I didn't say that it was great, but yeah, that's what it was. In that time, Ford would experience a lot of complaints, but one big thing that Ford did not anticipate was a class action lawsuit. So before I give this information, I'm going to let you guys know now that I am not an attorney and I am not a legal counsel of any sort. So if you have any legal concerns, feel free to reach out to your favorite attorney, but not me. Around 2018, Ford would receive a class action lawsuit filed saying that many of them at Ford knew, allegedly, that there was a problem with these transmissions when they were rolled out. Getting into it, my connection is that this transmission was a matter of cost cutting as well as a matter of politics. Back when Ford took that loan in 2008, I think that had something to do with the disbursement of funds. I'm not saying somebody was embezzling, I'm just saying some things got cut. And GetRag, who was their supplier at the time, had been making their transmissions, their dual clutch transmissions, wet up until that point. The decision to make the transmission dry is still unknown to this day. And shortly thereafter, roughly around 2011, it was noted that Ford would start working on tentatively fixing the transmission problem. But what ended up happening was that Ford basically said, girl, f***ing transmissions. And so because of that, the transmission problem continued to go on. It would seem as though Ford liked spending money. As a matter of resolution, Ford offered extended warranties and software patches. And I do want to go ahead and say this much, that Ford as a company is not the villain here. There's people within the company that made certain decisions that created the problem, and the company allowed them to continue to make those problems as long as the profits look right. Speaking of, roughly around 2009, I noticed in my research that Ford's stock price was also down at the time, and shortly thereafter, if you look between the years of 2011 to 2017, it kind of remains stable, but then it begins to fall off again. And part of this is because of the Ford management that they have continued to promote, but that's a whole different story in its entirety. Back to the transmissions. Back when this is initially launched in 2018, it was noted that Ford allegedly knew that they were distributing some really shitty transmissions. The Detroit Free Press did an incredible job of investigating what was going on during that time, and even so much so that Ford even responded and said that basically they felt like they was beating them up. And let me tell you, look her name up real quick. Let me tell you about this lady named Phoebe Wall-Howard. When I tell you she was on they necks, she was on their neck. She was one of the spearheading investigators and was one of the women who discovered the internal investigation documentation that Ford knew exactly what was the problem. In a document called Lessons Learned, it was pretty much expressed that Ford was aware that they knew that there was complaints and concerns from consumers, and part of that detailed back into what engineers had said prior to 2010, stating that the car itself was not ready for production and the dry clutch design is not favorable. In the process of this development, Ford has spent over millions and millions of dollars trying to do recalls, warranties, transmission patches, and lawsuits, trying to absolve themselves from the idea that had they made one simple change, that this really could have changed the entire trajectory and the experience of the Ford Focus as we know it. I say all this to say is that the dual clutch transmission is really one of the leading reasons to why we do not have a Ford Fiesta or a Ford Focus. And this is kind of a cautionary tale of what happens when you put something as big as the compact segment on the line for the sake of saving a couple of dollars. Now, arguably you could say that is because of the driver, but if your car suddenly loses power in the middle of you driving due to a faulty transmission that the company knew about, I'm sure you'd be pretty pissed about it. And I say all of this to say is that the Fiesta and the Focus were great cars for the first few generations, and introducing this is a matter of what happens when you put the dollar before the consumer. This has created an absolute whirlwind for most consumers, considering that the Focus and the Fiesta are widely distributed both within the US and the UK and other global markets, and we are beginning to see that Ford is kind of fall from the laurels of their legacy into the pits of recall hell. With that being said, leave a comment below and let me know what you think about the dual clutch transmission. If you've ever had a Ford Focus, what was your experience, and if you'd ever buy one again. And with that being said, until the next episode, I will see you guys later.